By early 1944, several sectors along the European front had become entrenched in a grinding stalemate. Snowmelt had turned roads into slow-moving rivers of mud. Armored divisions suffered from mechanical attrition, and infantry units reported exhaustion after months of continual movement. Archival reports show that both Allied and Axis command structures recognized a dangerous truth. Without a decisive maneuver, the front would remain locked in a costly war of attrition. Supply convoys struggled through compromised rail networks. Fuel allocations were reduced by up to 30%, and replacements could not keep pace with casualties. Engineers on both sides reviewed maps marked with choke points, river crossings, and timber-reinforced defensive lines. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, grainy, fog-layered images taken from high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, documented troop buildups but revealed few exploitable weaknesses. The Axis relied on fortified ridges and interlocking machine gun nests, while the Allies adopted a methodical advance supported by artillery, but suffered delays caused by poor terrain and a shortage of bridging equipment. Into this environment emerged a tactical requirement: identify a maneuver that could bypass hardened defenses without demanding heavy armor, which remained partially immobilized by terrain. Allied field commanders began studying a narrow corridor between two forest lines, a region dismissed earlier due to its uneven ground and limited road access. Archival engineering notes suggest that terrain previously deemed unsuitable for coordinated action might offer concealed movement if executed under strict timing and weather cover. The stage was set for a tactical innovation, one that depended not on overwhelming firepower, but on a precise reallocation of units, deception measures, and the exploitation of a subtle geographical feature overlooked by both sides. The stalemate would not last much longer. The turning point began with an unassuming reconnaissance report filed by a photo interpretation unit working out of a makeshift operations hut near the front. Analysts observed that melting snow had carved a shallow depression through a wooded sector previously labeled impassable. Though narrow, the depression ran parallel to concealed footpaths, providing potential cover for a coordinated infantry maneuver. Early assessments estimated the corridor might permit movement of approximately 2 battalions, if travel occurred at staggered intervals and heavy equipment remained silent. Military engineers were immediately consulted. Their tasks included determining soil composition, the load-bearing capacity of waterlogged ground, and whether sappers could reinforce the route without attracting enemy artillery. Archival notes revealed discussions about constructing temporary corduroy paths using salvaged timber from nearby forests. Crews practiced rapid deployment of these makeshift surfaces, each log cut to uniform length with 1930s-era mechanical saws powered by portable generators. Simultaneously, Allied meteorologists provided critical forecasts. Cloud cover was expected to thicken over the region for several consecutive days, offering natural concealment from Axis aerial reconnaissance. This was essential, as Axis forward observers had previously demonstrated rapid response times to any unusual troop concentration. The final review involved tactical officers evaluating whether the narrow depression offered strategic value beyond concealment. A map comparison revealed a vulnerable hinge in the Axis defensive line. 2 divisions coordinating over a poorly defined boundary with limited communication overlap. If Allied forces could infiltrate the corridor undetected, they might strike precisely where administrative seams created operational fragility. Engineering teams concluded the maneuver was feasible, difficult but achievable. With the right synchronization,
A previously ignored patch of terrain could become the key to unraveling a fortified front.
Execution required a logistical effort as intricate as the maneuver itself. Infantry units assigned to the operation trained in night movement, speed discipline, and silent advance techniques. Quartermasters redistributed rations and ammunition with strict limitations to reduce the load carried through the narrow corridor. For every man advancing, support staff calculated the precise consumption of water, medical supplies, and rifle ammunition for at least 48 hours of semi-isolated engagement. Sappers worked through freezing dawns, reinforcing the corridor. Archival accounts describe teams dragging felled timber through the mud, creating corduroy tracks stable enough for stretchers, communication gear, and light mortar components. Field telephones were tested using spooled copper wire, prone to interference but essential for maintaining contact during the maneuver. Signal operators practiced laying lines quickly, knowing that a single break could isolate the forward companies. Meanwhile, deception officers crafted diversionary plans. Dummy artillery emplacements, complete with canvas-painted barrels, were erected several kilometers away. Controlled bursts of radio chatter simulated preparations for an offensive in an entirely different sector. Veteran traffic control units regulated vehicle movement to mimic routine supply patterns, reducing the likelihood of enemy suspicion. Medical teams established forward aid posts, stocked with sulfa packets, bandages, and basic surgical tools. Historical accounts emphasize the improvisation involved, using wooden crates as operating surfaces, boiling instruments over portable stoves, and arranging lanterns to shield their glow from observers. By the end of preparation, the participating units understood the stakes. They would move quietly, almost invisibly, through a cramped and unforgiving landscape. Success depended on coordination measured in minutes, not hours. A misstep could alert the axis lines and trigger immediate countermeasures. Yet the engineers and planners believed the maneuver offered the best opportunity in months to shift the front.
The maneuver commenced under a moonless sky, with only dimmed lanterns and hand signals guiding the men forward. Archival testimonies described the eerie silence, boots sinking into softened earth, the creak of wooden slats under weight, and whispered instructions carried by cold wind. Movement occurred in small groups spaced evenly to prevent congestion and reduce noise. Each company followed pre-assigned pacing intervals, calculated to maintain steady progression through the depression without overlap. The terrain proved harsher than expected. Mud pulled at equipment straps, and several men lost footing on the corduroy's surfaces. Sappers walked alongside the column, repairing displaced logs in near-total darkness. Engineers had anticipated these issues, and roving teams carried replacement planks, mallets, and rope lashing kits. Their ability to restore the path without lantern light became critical to preserving the element of surprise. Signals personnel advanced early to establish communication nodes at predetermined checkpoints. They laid copper wire along the forest edge, keeping it low to the ground to avoid detection. Occasional breaks occurred when branches snapped under tension, forcing rapid splicing. Meteorological predictions held true. Thick cloud cover concealed the entire region, keeping Axis intelligence aircraft grounded. Despite the strain, discipline remained intact. Officers used hand taps and shoulder nudges rather than vocal commands. Machine gun crews carefully distributed weapon components among several carriers to reduce noise. Even small clinks of metal were wrapped in cloth to mute contact. At several points along the route, scouts reported faint sounds from Axis patrols beyond the tree line. Each time, the column froze in place, relying on darkness and terrain to mask their presence. The approach was slow, methodical, and nerve-tightening, but by the final hours before dawn, the leading companies had advanced deeper behind the defensive hinge than any prior attempt. The window for decisive action was opening.
Once the initial breach stabilized, Allied commanders shifted focus to widening the penetration to support additional units. This phase demanded close coordination between infantry, sappers, and communication teams. Field reports describe officers using grease pencils to mark new objectives directly onto acetate-covered maps, updated continuously as scouts returned with information. Sappers pushed forward with coil upon coil of communication wire and compact demolition kits. Their priority was to dismantle obstacles that could impede reinforcements or evacuations. Many of these barriers, barbed wire strands, buried steel stakes, and booby traps fashioned from 1930s-era detonators, required surgical precision to disable safely. Work was carried out under sporadic rifle fire, with sappers crouching low while infantry provided suppressive cover. To the north of the breach, a small brook created a muddy choke point. Engineers addressed this by laying additional corduroy paths using lumber carried in by mule teams. These improvised surfaces supported stretcher bearers transporting the first casualties to forward aid stations. Medical teams worked in shallow dugouts, reinforced with carpet bombing debris, treating wounds with sulfa powder and field dressings. Axis forces eventually mounted their first organized countermeasure, deploying machine gun crews from nearby reserves. Their fire forced Allied squads to adapt quickly, shifting positions and returning controlled bursts to keep enemy gunners suppressed. Mortar teams adjusted range settings using hand-drawn firing tables, compensating for the uneven terrain. Despite mounting pressure, the corridor expanded steadily. New units entered through the original depression, even as engineers reinforced the route with thicker timber layers and additional branches for camouflage. Every meter gained increased the Allies' ability to maneuver behind the Axis front, turning a narrow infiltration into a widening operational wedge. Momentum was shifting visibly. Once the initial breach stabilized, Allied commanders shifted focus to widening the penetration to support additional units. This phase demanded close coordination between infantry, sappers, and communication teams. Field reports described officers using grease pencils to mark new objectives directly onto acetate-covered maps, updated continuously as scouts returned with information. Sappers pushed forward with coil upon coil of communication wire and compact demolition kits. Their priority was to dismantle obstacles that could impede reinforcements or evacuations. Many of these barriers, barbed wire strands, buried steel stakes, and booby traps fashioned from 1930s-era detonators, required surgical precision to disable safely. Work was carried out under sporadic rifle fire, with sappers crouching low while infantry provided suppressive cover. To the north of the breach, a small brook created a muddy choke point. Engineers addressed this by laying additional corduroy paths using lumber carried in by mule teams. These improvised surfaces supported stretcher bearers transporting the first casualties to forward aid stations.
Medical teams worked in shallow dugouts reinforced with carpet bombing debris, treating wounds with sulfa powder and field dressings. Axis forces eventually mounted their first organized countermeasure, deploying machine gun crews from nearby reserves. Their fire forced Allied squads to adapt quickly, shifting positions and returning controlled bursts to keep enemy gunners suppressed. Mortar teams adjusted range settings using hand-drawn firing tables, compensating for the uneven terrain. Despite mounting pressure, the corridor expanded steadily. New units entered through the original depression, even as engineers reinforced the route with thicker timber layers and additional branches for camouflage. Every meter gained increased the Allies' ability to maneuver behind the Axis front, turning a narrow infiltration into a widening operational wedge. Momentum was shifting visibly.
As the Allies advanced deeper behind the hinge in the defensive line, Axis commanders realized the gravity of the situation. Their first assumption, that the assault was limited in scale, gave way to urgent warnings transmitted through field telephones and runners. But given the fragmented communication network between the two divisions responsible for the sector, responses arrived unevenly. Some units mobilized swiftly, while others hesitated for clarification. Archival records reveal that Axis officers attempted to reinforce the gap with machine gun detachments and reserve platoons equipped with bolt-action rifles and light mortars. However, these reinforcements were forced to navigate narrow forest trails, already disrupted by artillery earlier in the winter. Several units arrived piecemeal, unable to establish a unified defensive line. Meanwhile, Allied forces continued expanding their interior position. Scouts relayed information about Axis troop movement, allowing mortar crews to target assembly points accurately. The thunder of these indirect fire strikes created additional confusion among defenders attempting to consolidate. Axis attempts at counterattacking were hindered by miscommunication. Some platoons advanced toward the sound of gunfire, only to encounter unexpected resistance from machine gun positions already entrenched by Allied forces. Others were stalled by destroyed telephone lines and the difficulty of coordinating movements across the rugged terrain. Nevertheless, several Axis squads mounted determined local assaults. Infantrymen pushed forward behind tree trunks and shallow depressions, exchanging fire at close range with Allied riflemen. The fighting was intense and unpredictable, but the Allies' earlier preparations, preloaded ammunition, reinforced communication lines, and pre-established fallback points helped absorb the pressure. By late afternoon, Axis commanders faced an operational crisis. The breach now threatened to roll up their defensive flank, exposing supply depots and command posts. The battle for control of the sector reached its decisive moment.
As dusk approached, the full impact of the maneuver became clear. The Allied wedge, once narrow and fragile, had expanded into a corridor wide enough to support sustained movement of fresh battalions. Additional mortar teams, ammunition carriers, and medical staff flowed through the reinforced path, solidifying the new forward position. The Axis hinge, already strained by communication failures, began to collapse under pressure from multiple directions. Archival reports indicate that several Axis regiments were forced to withdraw hastily to avoid encirclement. In their retreat, they abandoned supply caches, damaged field guns, and improvised defensive structures that had taken weeks to construct. Allied engineers moved quickly to repurpose these resources, setting up new observation posts and artillery positions that further accelerated the shift of momentum. The decisive moment occurred when a flanking Allied company advanced onto a ridgeline overlooking the remaining Axis defensive pockets. From this vantage point, they were able to direct mortar fire with exceptional accuracy, targeting withdrawal routes and preventing organized counterattacks. The psychological impact of being struck from an unexpected direction contributed heavily to the Axis collapse. With the ridge secured, Allied reinforcements surged forward, linking the penetration with adjacent units and creating a continuous front. What began as a risky infiltration through an overlooked depression had become a fully exploited breakthrough. Terrain once dismissed as unusable had delivered strategic advantage. By the following morning, maps in the Allied command tent showed a redrawn front line, pushed forward several kilometers, bending the Axis defense backward and forcing a broad tactical realignment across the region. Commanders noted that the maneuver, though modest in scale compared to major offensives, had achieved an outcome disproportionate to its size. The front had shifted, the stalemate was broken, and a narrow corridor through forgotten terrain had changed the course of the campaign in 1944.